Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nikolai Minchev. I am a researcher at the Institute for Global Prosperity, and I would like to welcome you to this week's Soundbite seminar. I'm incredibly delighted that today's speaker is Andrew Percy, and that Andrew will be talking about universal basic services, which of course is one of the most exciting and innovative policy initiatives today. Andrew is co-director of the Social Prosperity Network at the IGP. He leads the IGP's work on 21st century welfare options, and he was also the lead author on the 2017 IGP report on universal basic services. And you can all download the report online for free, and we'll provide a link where you can do that. Today, Andrew will review recent developments with universal basic services in the new COVID situation, including examples from the UK and New Zealand. As usual, please send us your questions in the Q&A box, and then I will read them to Andrew during the Q&A period later on. So Andrew, thank you very much for joining us for a soundbite today, and over to you.
Nikolai, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm going to try and stick to that script, and we'll talk about universal basic services a little bit. What I hope to do today is to provoke you to think about things that you are probably seeing in the papers and how we might be able to solve these problems. And I think a lot of these have come up as a result of the changes in society and emphasis that COVID and the pandemic generally has created. So for the last, I think probably a week, a picture like this or something like it has been on the front page of various newspapers. And it's a fascinating time to have a point where it is at the forefront of the political debate. Whether we can feed the children that we have in our country. So the context I want to set on this is that, how much has the government spent? And the answer, according to a civil society minister, is around 200 billion that's been spent on what is basically supporting people. So that's not the total spending in COVID. And yet we still have hungry children over the school holidays, let alone potentially issues that carry on inside schools with the qualifications. And so an estimate that's been made to extend free school meals to every household that's receiving universal credit, because that's not the case today, is that it would cost about $1 billion. So how did we as a society manage to spend 200 billion in the last 7 or 8 months, and yet still end up with hungry children? So I'm going to try and address that question, but what I would encourage you to do, and I guess my takeaway for you, we'll come back to this at the end, is, what's your answer to this? How can it be that as a society, one of the richest societies that's ever existed, having spent this much money, so it's obviously not a question of access to money, has still been unable to fix this problem? And what would need to be different in order for that problem to have been solved? So I'm going to give you my version of an answer to that. The first point, the first slide here is actually a question to you. So I don't know if either probably in the chat, maybe you could have a guess as to what you think this chart is about. What does that line represent? So I don't know if I have my chat window open. I think I do. I will give you a couple of minutes in the event that you decide that you think you know what this is and you want to put an answer in the chat. So the answer to that is that this is a chart of government spending as a percentage of GDP. So effectively, it is taxation for what have we got here? Sort of 250 years, something like that. The Bank of England has very kindly collected these statistics and made adjustments for time and different periods and currencies and inflation. And this is a presentation of how much the country has been collecting in taxation. So the first point I would make is that in this period here, we can see that taxation sits at around 10% fairly constantly. The gray bars here represent wars. And so the Napoleonic Wars did result in an increase in taxation, but that fell down afterwards. And right the way up to the First World War, average tax collection in the UK stood at around 10%. So one of the things that I think we need to understand here is, while we talk about quite often development of a society, an economy, a nation, we tend to push the Industrial Revolution together with the later stages, which I would call a technical revolution. And what I would like you to see in this is that during the industrial portion of the development cycle, the amount of resources that societies need to assign to the collective, which is basically what taxation is, are relatively low. Human resources are largely based on their sort of physical presence, either their muscle or their physical attendance in a factory. But the levels of collective resource that need to be provided in order to support that development are pretty low. What then happens is we move, societies tend to move into a technical revolution. So part of what happened in the First World War and again the Second World War, apart from being obviously big solidarity events, was jumps in technical innovation that started to spur a second stage in the development cycle. So I'm going to focus in my talk mostly on this piece because I'm interested in what's happened in the last 100 years. And so we're going to flip from this chart to a zoom in of that. And the point that I want to make first is that effectively I'm using the level of taxation as an indicator for how much a society is willing to assign to collective uses. Right, so taxation goes up when we need to fund activities that are beyond the individual, which require the state to be able to implement. They also increase as the corollary of that, which is that individuals have less control over their lives. The outcome of their lives is much more dependent on the collective infrastructure. So the first gap, this first sort of jump that we had in the UK, and I use the UK because I think it's a useful model, one of the first countries to enter into this cycle of development through the Industrial Revolution and later. And for a number of other reasons, it actually provides quite an interesting model that can be applied in other situations. Although of course, every country is unique in some aspects of its development. But I think the UK provides a very interesting model to look at this. So the first jump we have after the First World War here is a jump in social insurance. And basically what's happened here, right, is that we have recognized as a society that the extent to which individuals have control over their safety and security has been lessened by the Industrial Revolution. So there's a response by society to start to create insurance programs. And a lot of these interwar programs were exactly that. One of the things that Beveridge did in 1943 during the Second World War was try and get rid of all of these incredibly complicated and overlapping insurance programs. And then after the Second World War, we get what I would call the welfare state section, and we get another jump in the amount of money that as a society we're prepared to pay in taxation. So, when I say prepared to pay, I say this advisedly, right? That tax only really works when people are sort of voluntarily compliant with it. And so, of course, there's a legal enforcement portion. But when a society jumps up from collecting 25% of GDP in taxation to something closer to 40% in GDP, that's because there has been a general consensus that this is a good thing to do, that it's in people's advantage. And I think that this speaks then to the progress of development, the increasing need for education. I mean, the two big programs that we see rolled out across most of the developed countries post-Second World War are health programs and education programs. And largely on a universal basis, and luckily for us in the UK, our health system here, a completely universal service. So there's sort of two good examples of universal basic services. And they were introduced because they were needed to support the development track of the society. So I want to then point out that something else happened after the Second World War, which is that there appears to be some sort of limit here on how much taxation that society was prepared to tolerate. It does, you know, these are sort of broad measures, and one of the reasons I don't have kind of, you know, absolute numbers on here is because it's about the broad passage of time and these measurements. And we can see that it does go above 40% at various points. There might be reasons for that, either oil crises or financial crises. But it's still reasonable to say that as a country, since the Second World War, there was a jump, but there hasn't been a consistent willingness to carry on with that. So I'm going to draw sort of two lines on this chart. One is what I would call the development line. And this is the amount of resources. So that's the red line here that shows you an increasing level of allocation to collective use. And, you know, again, to reiterate, right, these are taxes go to things that individuals cannot build for themselves. So large healthcare systems, education systems, things like that. But we also see another line across here, which is some sort of resistance to additional levels of taxation. And the point I'm going to draw your attention to is where these lines intersect. So in the 1970s in the UK, we had what we were calling a Hirschman moment, referring to Albert Hirschman, who was studied political, wrote a lot about political economy and a lot about development in the 20th century. And this is a moment at which there sort of development, which I think has its own momentum. It's not something, it's of such benefit to most of the people, most of the time in society, that it's not a political decision as to whether you carry on developing or not, that it has its own impetus and it has its own costs and needs that I think are primarily collective. But when you reach this point where there is a potentially a tension between the amount of resources a society has to assign to its development and collective use, and a willingness to pay additional taxation, we reach a sort of critical point. So in the UK, this Hirschman moment, as we will call it, was, coincided also with the oil crisis. But nevertheless, during the 1970s, a lot of the consensus that had stood since the Second World War started to fall apart, and there was a new reckoning to be had. Now, we're going to talk a little bit, or I'm going to talk a little bit about that moment and the decisions that were made in that moment and how we kind of adjusted as a society to that. But I will make the point that I think that this development, I don't know whether it carries on in a straight line, and we're going to move in a moment to versions of this graph that are relatively simplified. I'm sure it's not a straight line. I'm sure it's much more like the wavy line that we see in tax rates, but nevertheless, it continues to be higher than it is. If we add together some very uncontroversial components of additional expense that are commonly recognized to be outstanding today, the IFS estimates that we're going to need an additional 2% of either taxation or austerity to maintain the current debt levels, so that's not to pay them down. The OBR has done work on continuing aging costs that will come as a result of, part of the consequence of development is better education and better healthcare, and that means people live longer, and then that has additional cost implications. So there are aging costs that are still to come in our society. We would argue that there are deficiencies in livelihoods and secure livelihoods, and we've done work both in the UBS work and others have done more broadly on what the sort of total gap there, what it would cost to bridge those livelihoods. And various people in the IMF and the OECD have done work on what the sort of aggregate climate investment is. And this is a number that surprises people as being incredibly low, but something like 1% of GDP. So there's at least another 10% of GDP that is currently not being funded. And I just put that up there to say that this red line carries on. Whether it carries on in a straight line or a little bit wavy, it's certainly going to be higher than the levels of taxation we have today. So in some ways, we are revisiting our Hirschman moment in the 1970s. So this is the simplified version of that diagram. And with the help, hopefully will help to kind of clarify the argument that we're making. So we make a distinction here between two portions that we would say are equally important in the development of a society. That people expect a level of safety. Based on that safety, which is largely collective and social, they can then engage their particular abilities, skills, and use opportunity as a way of moving themselves forward in their lives. That this yellow line then denotes roughly what we were seeing in terms of the acceleration of collective resource allocation that's necessary as a society develops. And then the blue dotted line here to reference this idea that we can see reflected in the UK numbers that at some point there appears to be a boundary for allocation towards tax that that meets some resistance. And I'll make a point here that, I mean, the reason material is put in there is because I want to be very clear, and in fact, it's key to the argument here, that what we're talking about with opportunity can consist of two different things. That for some people, simply the sort of freedom and ability to pursue their particular ambitions and skills, right? The reward does not consist entirely of material gain. It's not just about money. It's not just about control of resources. There are other rewards that most people will value as part of their opportunity. So I'm going to go on here. Excuse me if I get the slide development right. So I'm just pointing out there that there are social and collective needs represented in this graph that are currently in excess of the space that is available for taxation. That we have this Hirschman moment when those lines crossed, which for the UK was in the 1970s. And then the question at that Hirschman moment is, how are you going to bridge this gap? So if we analyze what the UK's response, and I mean, you know, not the UK alone, many societies in the developed world reached their own Hirschman moments at around about the 1970s and into the 80s. The response was to look at that and just say, well, we can't afford anything more. The welfare state is unaffordable. The state has become inefficient in the resource allocation, and that the best way to deliver safety in society is to encourage people to use their opportunity, and that we're therefore effectively placing safety behind opportunity. So we're saying that in order for people to have, and this is an argument that no doubt you hear rehearsed very often in the political environment, which says that, you know, in order to get a good healthcare service, we need to have a very successful economy. That what's important there is the placement and the hierarchy of these things. So rather than engaging with safety and opportunity as two mutually dependent features of a developing society that need to be held in balance, it places safety as an outcome of opportunity. And in that way, kind of reimagines what needs to happen in society. So there are all sorts of outcomes that result once you have placed them in that order. And if we look at what the response was of governments and the UK government in particular, and how to bridge this gap, because it wasn't that there was a denial that the ongoing development of society needed to have additional safety provided. It became a question of, well, the way to fund that is not through taxation. What we need is, smaller states and lower taxes and free enterprise. And the free enterprise will create the money that allow people to create their own individual safety. So we split the kind of consequences or how to bridge that gap into three primary areas. So I'll go from the bottom here. The social externalities. What we mean by that is that there were aspects to social safety that were considered to be unnecessary. And so these were effectively avoided. So we see much more conditional welfare systems being introduced starting in the 1970s. And the premise here is that this should be an absolute minimum, that it's not designed to enhance safety. It's designed to prevent just the most abject failures of safety. And then the second thing, this middle wedge of orange here, is that there was a premise that said, okay, so instead of taxing you to create these safety services, healthcare, old age, that kind of thing, what you should do as an individual is that you should create your own savings. And that through your personal contribution to your savings, you will effectively be replacing what would have been provided through the taxation system. Obviously, that has a big problem. It fails to recognize the difference between collectively provided and reliable safety that a society can afford, but individuals can't. But nevertheless, it was the proposal. It was sort of central to that, was that safety doesn't have to come down as long as you are successful and you use your opportunity. Then you can take some of your money and we will reduce your taxation so that you have spare money. And then you can put that into your private savings, and then that'll be there for you in your later life. And you can use that money to create the safety that you need. That has all sorts of implications, which we will go into the paper when it comes out in, we hope, in December, to do with the reliability of savings. Because effectively what the government has done in this situation is attempt to transfer responsibility for safety from the collective to the individual. And if you do that as a state, then what you also have to do is ensure that the savings are safe, right? So you can't pass that responsibility to individuals, tell them to save, and then when there's a financial crisis, allow those savings to be destroyed, because effectively the deal has been undone. And then the third area in which it's possible to try and make this kind of balance work without increases in taxation is to simply avoid certain costs. So, the one that I would pick out here are that a lot of these are environmental costs, but they're also kind of social ones, that they're two aspects of the same coin. But if you don't introduce a carbon tax and you allow the existing businesses to do well, you are effectively externalizing costs that are going to arrive sooner or later. And I think that one of the if we look at the characteristics of the problems today, is that we've got both of these social externalities are returning and to demand to be internalized and recognized. And we've got things that we thought maybe we could put aside, whether that's pollution, environmental, those kinds of externalities that are also now knocking on the door and demanding to be heard. But nevertheless, what it looks like as you go into this process is that maybe you can bridge this gap without raising taxation. And you use some combination of these three strategies to make that look real. So we would argue that actually there's a different way of looking at this, and that what was missing from that original argument was that, in fact, safety is a basis for opportunity, not actually an outcome of opportunity. That if you want an innovative and vibrant economy that is able to tolerate creative destruction, that actually what you need to do is provide sufficient levels of safety to enable that kind of economic activity. And that further than that, that there is a point at which where safety is sufficiently effective that it allows people to transition their rewards away from purely material and monetary rewards into areas of non-material reward. So that is the opportunity that existed. And that's one of the reasons we call this a sort of Hirschman level, and the Hirschman moment was that, you know, he recognized that in particular moments, there are in fact possibilities, different ways that societies can react to any specific moment on the development path. And what we're trying to point to here is perhaps a different way that could be looked at that, where the development needs of a society start to conflict with what looks like the maximum opportunity boundary. But we would argue that actually that opportunity boundary is dependent on how much safety people experience. The safer people feel, the less, you know, basically the less worried you are about putting food on the table for your kids and your family, then the more you can actually focus on other aspects that might be equally rewarding to you. But you're not going to focus on those if you don't have your basic safety intact. So there's another opportunity here and another way to deal with this problem. And, you know, basically that's what universal basic services is about, can we shift that opportunity up by increasing the level of general safety that people experience in their society, and that allow them to then transition their rewards into non-material rewards, and that then allows the taxation rate to rise. I'm not sure exactly what level, but let's say higher than it is today. You know, I don't think the expectation is that anybody is going to transition 100% of their rewards, but we don't need to do that, right? The marginal distinctions here between the amount of resource we need to allocate to actually create functional societies and effective economies that are not unstable and able to respond, for instance, to a kind of emergencies like pandemics much more efficiently and effectively, is something, you know, in the region of let's say called 10%. The numbers we put up earlier were around 11%. So we're talking about relatively marginal changes in the overall allocation between safety and opportunity in a society as reflected in its taxation rate. And I think that there certainly is opportunity there for that portion of rewards to be transitioned from material rewards into non-material rewards. So my answer, or the answer that universal basic services would suggest here, is that direct action to increase safety does not in fact detract from motivation. It is the bedrock that allows a vibrant and innovative economy, because it allows creative destruction to happen without it being fundamentally destabilizing to the core of the societies. And universal basic services, rather than any of the other approaches, because in the end, what enables the transition of rewards out of the material is the reliability of that safety. And the simple fact is that as an individual, you can never actually create as reliable a set of resources than you will get from your community. So this has been true throughout our history, remains true today. You know, not only can you not individually build the roads and the hospitals, but these are assets that once we've built them together are very reliable, concrete, way beyond what happens to me in my life and whether I keep my job or not. Those kinds of variabilities in the individual are ameliorated in the collective. And so it's in fact collective resources that are able to generate the level of reliability that allows people to transition their rewards to alternative systems. So I think that's my answer. So, back to where we started, I would say, feed the kids. This isn't a complicated problem. When the Finnish want to fix their housing problems and they've got a homeless problem, they build houses and give them to homeless people. If we have hungry children, we should be feeding them. I wouldn't personally be a huge fan of spending loads of money on vouchers. It would be great if every community had a community kitchen in their constituency and we could use that sort of resource. So Nikolai, I think that's enough from me at this point. I don't know if that's the timing's right. We could address some questions.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew, so much. Okay, so I'm going to start off the Q&A with a rather broad and big question. Okay. And that is if you can say a little bit about how you envisage the future of public services and the future of welfare in the UK after Brexit. And at the moment, there are quite a lot of things that are happening, quite a lot of things are going on. I mean, firstly, everyone is terrified because nobody knows what's actually going to happen after January, but also the sort of situation with the free school meals, I don't think is particularly inspiring at the moment for the future of welfare. And I just wanted to ask you how you see the future of services after Brexit. Do you see opportunities? Are you hopeful at all that some of these UBS initiatives might be implemented? What's your view on that?
I'm not sure that, frankly, that Brexit is an event in and of itself that changes the story around this. My sense and the work that we've done suggests that we're in a larger narrative here, that in fact Brexit is probably an expression of the sort of social externalities that we have engaged in through the last 40 years. And that where we don't provide a much more universal and reliable sense of safety to our populations, then we can expect a political response from that. So, I don't know any economists or otherwise who think that Brexit is going to be, a net positive, either on the economic resource front or coming on top of the pandemic. So, as an event, it's not helpful. But within the context of the larger problems we have, and if we sort of put climate change into this, which has a relatively short time horizon as well, I think there are much bigger problems that we're going to be facing that will need to be addressed. In terms of the development of universal basic services, we're lucky enough here in the UK to already have a universal basic service for healthcare. That's something that in America could probably save them 10% of GDP that they could then afford to spend on other services. But we already have that here. I think one of the great advantages of the sort of concept of universal basic services is it does two things. First of all, it points to the interrelationship between all of these, so that you act in one area and it strengthens the other. In the UK, we've been having an ongoing debate for the last 5 years about the relationship between social care and the NHS. Clearly, these are interrelated services, and action on one is, helps the other. And we've seen this with COVID and discharges and social care. Um, the, the, the second aspect of universal basic services that is very helpful in terms of looking at implementation is that it's not a wholesale change, right? This is all incrementally possible. You could start transport services in one portion of the country. You can enhance digital access in a community. You can act at very granular levels at a much smaller scale to improve these things. And that's one of the things that we've been working with London boroughs to take this and see where they can effectively act. And so we have experiments going with rolling out digital broadband into social housing estates. These are all, that's just an example of a small incremental change that is all part of achieving this objective, where what we're trying to do is reduce the cost of living and increase people's sense of safety. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask a second question very quickly before we open up to the floor. But I wonder what role the question of inequality plays in your thinking about UBS, because income inequalities, of course, have been on the rise for the past 40 plus years. And also, we're now in a situation where the top 1% get 15% of the income, which is a huge amount of wealth that goes towards funding 1% of society. So I was just wondering if you can, give a bit of clarification about whether or in what ways you're thinking about inequality in relation to UBS.
So inequality is a huge aspect, and where we see it fitting in is that if you look back at a decision that says, well, we can't increase taxation, we just can't afford it, therefore we can't afford the welfare state, therefore we're going to pass responsibility back to individuals and that they should save for themselves to create their own security. There's a massive glaring problem with that, which is that the vast majority of the populations in the developed countries simply don't have spare income to be able to save. So inequality has a sort of cascading impact, not just in the moment at the time in terms of people's ability to access resources, but also an inability to access kind of long-term safety and security. And other people have referred to this as the precariat or the precariousness of life nowadays. At the IGP, we do a lot of work around what we would call secure livelihoods. And what we mean by this is that it has become very difficult on the sorts of incomes that a lot of people have only have access to be able to secure for themselves a decent livelihood. And what we're doing on the welfare front says that's not just about today, but it's also about tomorrow. So I think inequality is a huge part of this. Now, to what extent the rollout of enhanced safety and security across the general population will then have a knock-on impact on the distribution of resources, I think is an interesting outcome and secondary effect. Of course, we have to take the first step to get to know that. My expectation would be that a program of universal basic services substantially redistributes power across society, because it enables people to make very personal choices about what they do and they don't want to do for work, what the rates of labor are. And by shifting power in society away from, let's say, a group and re-empowering another much larger group, which is most of the people in society that don't have enough income to save, that we are enabling a redistribution of not only economic resources, but also power, and that therefore is bound to have a long-term positive effect on the distribution of equality and equity within society.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So we're going to open it up to the floor now, and the first question comes from Amritpal Gill. who asks, the graph by the Bank of England is super interesting, although I would be curious to hear whether this reflects the money made from the British Empire and East India Company, which was a source of income for government.
Mm. So it only goes back to, as you will have seen, kind of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and that chart really only speaks about how much of incomes in the UK were raised to speak to government tax. So there's undoubtedly true, and one of the things we point to in the paper, and we kind of in that fan chart about how to respond to any of these moments. What do you do in a situation where your society has greater needs than your population wants to be taxed? And so empires throughout history have typically been able to engage in a fairly simple exploitation, which is that you go next door and you take their resources. So if you were the Romans, you had a constantly expanding circle from which you were drawing resources, which you then used to fund your central state. And one of the key distinctions between the modern world, the 21st century that we're living in, is that that's no longer possible. The world has shrunk. Lots of other people have enough power to be able to defend them, the moral acceptance of a lot of this sort of exploitative activity. Not that it's completely absent in today's modern world, but it's just less of an opportunity. And that's one of the differences between today and, let's say, 200-300 years ago, when it was possible to exploit the rest of the world, something outside of your particular society, whether that was the exploitation in the East India Company or whether it was slavery in the West Indies. These were all effectively ways of exploiting external resources to be able to bring those resources internally and then kind of effectively save yourself from being able to tax your own people. And that's not really an option anymore. I can't speak to whether the Bank of England, have got data around how much the government budget was subsidized by, I think that's your question, the East India Company, but I'm sure it was significant.
Thank you. So next question is from Chris Harker, who asks, are the changes since 1910 technical or political? This is also the time of gender and class enfranchisement, which gives greater voice to, sorry, the chat moved, so I lost the question, which gives greater voice to people vis-a-vis the state.
Mm. So I think that this is, that there is certainly an interesting question here to be had in this development uptake, right? So if we look at just the last 100 and X years of the UK, to what extent was this a socially driven development, and to what extent was social development driven by economic and technical possibilities? And I think unwrapping one from the other is quite an exercise, and I'm sure it's debatable on both sides. I think what the premise that we're certainly working from in our work is that there are jumps in innovation that are largely economic, that those, to take advantage of those development opportunities, a society has to invest in its human capital, that you need an educated population much more once you're in that technical cycle of the revolution, and therefore that there are economic drivers that are pushing development in a particular area, and that the consequence of those is that you need, in fact, you don't have a choice as a society, but to open up these kinds of social opportunities that come along as well.
Great. So our next question is from Alexander Brown, who asks, what lessons did you infer, if any, from the 2017-2018 Universal Basic Income Study in Finland?
So that was relatively a small study, but I think I can speak probably, and maybe this is the question really, is about basic income versus basic services. And what the core of this builds down to is, what do you think the problem in society is today? If the problem is defined as a lack of freedom, then increasing people's personal incomes is the way to do that. If the problem is defined as a lack of safety, then we would argue that the first level of action that's necessary is on the creation of a reliable safety infrastructure that is effectively social and collective. And that the issue with basic income is that if you look at the amount of space that might be available within a fiscal structure and you prioritize incomes, are you going to be able to also meet your social and collective needs, right? So the sort of less abstract version of that argument is, is anyone in the UK going to give up the NHS for a UBI? And I think the answer to that is no, and they shouldn't, because it would cost you, and the Americans spend twice as much on healthcare as we do, that's actually a poor trade. So every individual's ability to create a secure livelihood for themselves consists partly of the strength of the social infrastructure that exists. And if you prioritize the distribution of cash over the development of these social infrastructures, you are effectively unable to achieve the objective that you're after, because the income cannot deliver the collective services that are necessary. So then the subsequent argument from a lot of people becomes, oh, we should do UBI and UBS. And I have, no philosophical problem with that argument, but there is, and it's important in policy, that you look at sequencing and you look at the implications of one on the other. And so we would argue that because it's incrementally possible, because it has a dramatically efficient effect on reducing people's cost of living, that the primary focus in the first stages should be on the development of comprehensive universal basic services. And then we can look at UBI as an extension of that program.
Great. So now we have a question from anonymous attendee who asks, in your view, do you think safety or lack thereof has any impact on consumerism generally, or only on material concerns that aim to cover basic needs?
I think that the short answer is yes, I absolutely think it has an impact on consumerism. And I think that once you have set up a narrative in your society that says fundamentally that we as a collective, as a society, can't provide the levels of social safety that will satisfy you, that the highest calling you can pursue is your own individual material reward, and that through that calling, you will then effectively create your own personal security. That is a narrative and a series of logical links that ends in consumerism. So I think that for a lot of people, it's the consumer activity is effectively a replacement activity for the safety and security that more unconsciously that they're actually trying to achieve. And so I think there is a direct link between not providing safety. And this is, I think at the core of what we were trying to say there about the transition of rewards from material to non-material. When people feel unsafe, then the natural inclusion is towards material gain and material resource control, because instinctively that should provide a level of safety. And if you can't get it from your society, there is no other option left but to try and acquire more material gain yourself in order to recreate that.
Yes. Okay, so next question is from Roman Malin Hiscock, who says, I can think of a few people who have built their public profiles around UBI, for example, Andrew Yang, but none for UBS. And he says that he might be wrong, and you can let him know. Do you think individual, in quotations, mascots for UBS, nationally or globally, have an important role to play?
I guess we could start back at the first slide. Is Marcus Rushford now the first mascot for universal basic services? I think you're absolutely right. You know, we can think of presidential candidates that have run specifically on a UBI ticket. You know, what's perhaps less well appreciated is that if you actually look inside pretty much every Green New Deal proposal, what you will find within there is universal basic services. In fact, if you look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's proposal in the US government, it's a pretty short paper, but I mean, I think everything is in there except for free internet. So, you know, housing, secure livelihoods, all of those aspects. So there aren't mascots that are going around, you know, kind of waving necessarily the universal basic services flag. And neither is Marcus Rashford or any of the people supporting this food campaign. And I wouldn't expect them to. I mean, I think that, you know, it may be a useful banner for a political organization to pick up and use. And certainly the Labour Party produced their own universal basic services document at the conference before the last election. And you can see a lot of that reflected in the Labour Party manifesto. Whether people want to use the term universal basic services, I think is less important than whether people emphasize this general direction of travel, that by increasing shared resources, collective access to reliable things that increase our sense of safety and reduce our cost of living, that, or whatever people want to call it. And there's plenty of people making advocacy around those kind of subjects out there.
Great. Okay, so next question is from Heather Yin, who asks, will UBS result in a huge waste of resources? Is it going to increase the wealth gap?
So, you know, we can go back to the point that I was pointing to there, the sort of Hirschman moment for the UK. And recognize that one of the perceptions at the time was that a large and ineffective and wasteful state was wasting money effectively and unable to pursue its, actually deliver on its objectives. So one of the key kind of, you know, the winter of discontent, and I don't know whether that's, you know, anything that the audience is particularly familiar with, but we had reached a point there, if you look at that chart, where taxes started to go way above 40%. And at the same time, there were bodies unburied and rubbish in the streets. And it was clearly evident that we were paying a lot of money and the way that we were delivering these services was ineffective. Now, it's a complicated picture in that environment in terms of labor relations and the sort of corporatist structures that had developed around how to do government. We're now in the 21st century, and it's one of the things that we're keen to emphasize on universal basic services is that this is not about a unitary state delivering these services. These should be local services that are co-designed with people within the context of a vibrant local democracy that is able to assign the resources as appropriate for their particular community. And you know, one community versus another will need more on transport and less on shelter and housing, or you know, any of those combinations. There are roles for the state in a future 21st century welfare system of any kind, but they largely revolve around creating and securing the rights for individuals to have the right of access to these services and collecting the money at the highest level possible. So let's think of it as a national level, and distributing those resources back down to local communities where the services are actually co-designed and co-delivered. So I think that there are answers to the inefficiencies that were pointed to 40 years ago, and we know how to do those a lot better.
Andrew, we have about 3 minutes left and we have 3 questions. So I'm thinking about asking all 3, and then you can decide whether you answer all of them or choose a particular one. So first one is from Ting Rui Zhang, who says, could you please say something about methods or techniques, such as how to collect, hunt, or model your research data, how to clean, process, analyze your data, and how to combine different types of data? Then we have a question from Konrad Mitsukiewicz, who asks, should delivery of some universal services be devolved to regions or local authorities? And we have a question from Hannah Baumann, who asks, what's the difference between UBS and socialism? And you have about 3 minutes.
Yeah, so so for Ting, I'm sorry, I'm not a data specialist, and so I'm unable to respond directly to the particular questions that you have. But we're happy to take the question offline. You can see my email there, and I could forward it on to someone else in the team, perhaps, that could help address that. For Konrad, I hope that, you know, actually we just addressed that absolutely it's not just that there's, you know, that there's an opportunity to involve regions and local communities. It is essential that these services are delivered at the lowest level that is reasonable and feasible. So I think that, you know, yes, it should be definitely devolved to regions and local authorities, but there are some of these services, and one of the things that, you know, Anna Coote and I have pointed out in the book, The Case for Universal Basic Services, is that the same logic for service design and delivery does not apply to food as it does to shelter, as it does to information services and transport. That in each area, or childcare or social care, you know, there are specific circumstances, and certainly not beyond the wit of modern society to figure out the differences between those. There isn't a sort of one size fits all, this is how you do universal basic services, and it applies everywhere. Hannah, so what is the difference between UBS and socialism? Unfortunately, there are words like capitalism and socialism that get used in and have all sorts of background context that I can't determine what you mean by socialism. If you were sitting in America and asking me that question, then the equivalent that might be over here would be, what's the difference between UBS and communism, for instance? The answer is that UBS is a way of providing safety in society. It retains, it does not require that the economic system leave the capitalist framework. It does not involve anything other than democracy as the method of making decisions. And so, you know, within the framework of, it's a 21st century way of doing welfare, within a democratic system, with a competitive economy that is partially responsible for resource allocation. Whether that fits with your definition of socialism or anyone else's, I can't necessarily tell you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew, so much. Unfortunately, we cannot give you a real life round of applause, but we can probably do the second best thing, which is the people on the panel can unmute, and we can give you a round of applause this way. So thank you very much.